So do you believe that evil actually exists? My name is Jacob Hubbard, and this is Freedom Chapter 24, brought to you by Incarnate Ministries, based out of St. Thomas Aquinas in Pilot Point, Texas. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, especially for our little mini-series here. We're going to be continuing on today. We've understood arguments for God's existence. We've flushed out characteristics of God from that, and now we're going to understand what evil is, or perhaps isn't. Who knows? Okay, so we're going to begin. Evil is a privation of the good. What does that mean? It means it's a lack. So we're going to go back to the rose bush example that we talked about earlier, right? So last video we mentioned that a rose bush that possesses goodness is one that blooms beautiful roses, right? But a rose bush that does not bloom beautiful roses, in a sense, is lacking, right? Like what it should do, which is produce beautiful roses. And it's not that the rose bush itself is evil, but that lack, that privation of a good that ought to be there by the thing's nature, by a rose bush's nature, right? Like we don't expect a rose bush to fly or to produce dandelions or, to talk. So we don't expect it to do those things, but we do expect it to produce roses. And so the fact that that thing is lacking from the rose bush is an evil. So that's what evil is. So in a way, it doesn't actually exist. It's simply a privation of what ought to be there. There's no essence to evil itself like there is to goodness. Like goodness is perfection. Evil is simply a lack. So goodness is light. We can say it's like light. And darkness is like evil. Darkness is simply a privation or a lack of light. Like darkness itself doesn't have an essence or an existence apart from light. If it weren't for light, then darkness wouldn't be, because darkness is only in reference to light, if that makes sense, right? Where this analogy falls apart, though, is it seems to say that evil has to exist alongside good, and that is completely wrong. We as Catholics do not believe that. We're not Manichaeans who believe that good and evil are two things that are constantly wrestling with one another. Evil is a privation, so it doesn't really even exist. And two, goodness is completely perfect on its own. Evil does in no way has to exist, right? Evil only has to exist as a possibility for us to be free, right? Because goodness is God, right? And so evil is turning away from God. Evil is God's absence. And so that possibility had to exist in order for Adam and Eve to be free. So when they made that free decision to turn away from God, evil had to exist as a possibility for them to do so, right? I hope that makes sense. Like evil doesn't exist alongside God or anything like that. Like God is existence itself. Evil only is the lack of God that was brought about only by human action, not by God, not by his choice or will, because God, he can't will non-being. He can't will anything that is not him, right? Like there's no way for him to do that. So evil is simply the lack or the absence of God that has come about by our free turning away from God through sin. So there are two types of evil. We've talked about one and hinted at another. So the one we talked about is natural evil, right? And so we see things that things should naturally have, a dog should naturally have fur. Humans should naturally have toes. Rose bushes should naturally have thorns. And when a dog doesn't have fur, or when a human doesn't have toes, it's not that human or that dog is intrinsically evil. No. It's just that lack of toes or fur or thorns on the rose bush, that is a sign of evil. That itself is evil. We know that everything is good, because goodness is the achievement of some perfection, as we talked about in the last video, and we've mentioned here, like the rose bush budding, right? And everything, in a sense, has achieved a perfection in its very being, right? So the very fact that I am as a human is an achievement of a perfection of the image of God, right? So God implanted his image in me when he created me. We know that theologically. And so by the very fact that I am intrinsically good because his image is within me. To state our natural goodness a little bit more succinctly, let's say it like this. So in everything that's created, there ought to be a goodness in it by the very fact that it's created by a good God, right? Because God is good and he infuses himself into whatever he creates, right? So from that reasoning, we can come to conclude that everything that is intrinsically good, because there is an achievement of the perfection of God's own goodness in the very creation of the thing. It's a little bit more philosophically dense. And it's not necessary for us to understand these arguments, but it's a really important point that I wanted to bring up. We've seen that there's natural evil so far, right? But we haven't talked about the second kind of evil, and that's moral evil. But before we move on, again, I just want to emphasize that we as Catholics believe everything is intrinsically good, right? Because it's created by a good God, and that's biblical in the creation accounts, that there is, like, that we are good, right? So we believe that everything in the world is good insofar as it is created by a good God. So second, moral evil. That is evil that is brought about by our choice. And I think I've mentioned this a little bit before, but I'm going to go into a more in-depth analogy as to how this works. It's very similar to natural evil, but it is still a little bit different as well. So let's take the example of getting up in the morning. So when I get up in the morning, my alarm goes off. I have a decision to make there, right? The highest good, the best thing that I can do is to stop my alarm, get up, pray, shower, eat, get to work, right? Like all of those things that I should be doing that are good for me, like showering is good, prayer is good, and then eating is good. Like those are all kind of the highest goods in that scenario. I'm doing them. But let's say instead I hit the snooze button. I'm not like pursuing evil there. It's impossible to pursue evil. Like we are always drawn toward the good. We can't will non-being just like God can, right? But what happens is I'm pursuing a lower good. Sleep, in this instance, it's very important, but it's a lower good than the duty that I'm called to do during the day, right? Especially like prayer and things like that. So by hitting the snooze button there, I'm replacing a higher good with a lower good. And that is a privation, right? And that privation is moral evil, aka sin. And so we can take this all the way down to like the lowest fruit here. Like I could just sleep in as late as I wanted. I could wake up, I could take my roommate's credit card, and I could buy a bunch of crap that I don't need and charge it all to his card, ship it all to my place, you know, and like that is a very low fruit, but they're still good there. Like material good is still a good. But in acting, I'm proclaiming that thing as the highest good. And that is where the privation comes into play, because the highest good is actually replaced with a lower good, and then there's a lack of privation that happens there. We're metaphorically reaching up the fruits, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and putting our thing there above what should be there, right? So that's actually like the knowledge of good and evil is actually a metaphor for the way that desire and sin works in moral evil. All evil is a result of human action. It's in no way a result of God, because like we talked about, God is goodness itself, and evil is a privation of the good. And so there's no way that God can will something that is not himself, like that is other than him in some way, right? Like especially evil, which is like the lack of him. He can't do that, right? So evil is brought about by angelic choice that turned away from God, so Satan and all of the angels that fell, and then our choice, our sin that brings turned us away from God and entered darkness and sin and evil into this world. And we see natural evil and then, of course, moral evil. And so what the devil does is he presents evil to us, or things to us, and makes them seem like they're the highest good. Evil enslaves us. It's not good. It's not a sign of our freedom. It's not a mark of our freedom. All it is, it's slavery, it's division, it's destruction. God himself is the source of all goodness and perfection in this world. And there's no being that's apart from him. And evil is simply division and corruption and confusion of that. And so, like evil, it doesn't make us happy. It doesn't make us free in any sort of way. It divides us. It confuses us. It leads us down dark paths. It makes us, like, ultimately, it makes us believe lies about ourselves. It makes us hate ourselves. It makes us hate those around us. It makes us hate even God. It turns us away from God and builds walls so that we never let anyone in. And then we just hear more lies and more sin and more things that we continue to accept. And so that we're isolated and cut off and like not living free at all. People think that like by sinning, by doing these acts that are sins, that they are free, but they're not. They're enslaved. Teresa of Avila, one of my favorite saints and an amazing church mystic, said that one of her friends asked the Lord to see what a soul looks like in the state of mortal sin. And her friend said that if more people saw that, they would never sin again. Not just that they would hate sin, but they would never sin again. The devil likes to make us believe that sin is not a big deal. And that sin, like I said, is a mark of our freedom. But it's in no way that. It is destruction, and it is the thing that prohibits us from the freedom, the love, and the joy that we ultimately desire. So what am I saying? I'm not saying like we're all sinners and like we need to feel really bad about this. I want us to recognize sin for what it is, so that way we can see how much more we deserve, because we are intrinsically good, and God has called us for goodness. And we've already articulated through that example with moral choice that we desire goodness. We don't desire evil. And so when evil occurs over and over again, like I said, it leads us into slavery and destruction. But we aren't made for that. We're made for goodness. We're made for freedom. And so this isn't some sort of like thing to make us all feel bad about the sins that we've done, but simply to build up an understanding of why we should avoid sin, and that whenever we do sin, to run to the mercy of the Father, because we should never envision our own sinfulness without the mercy and love of God, who dies for us and redeems us at every single moment. So we talk a lot about the importance of surrender to God, right? And that's extremely, extremely important, especially whatever state we find ourselves in, just continual surrender to God. But also, there's a part 2 of that, and that's acting rightly, right? Like acting how He desires for us to act, so that we can learn to love the things that we should love rather than the things that we do love, because sin has corrupted our desires, right? And that's where the 10 Commandments come in. And that's how they bring us to freedom, because they show us how much more we desire, or that we deserve, and they increase our desires and our hunger for the infinite, so that we can actually be fulfilled. So today's challenge, pray through the 10 Commandments and see which one is the most difficult for you to follow, and begin to ask the Lord why that is, and maybe surrender something with any resistance or anything that comes up. Maybe surrender that to the Lord. Thank you guys. Have a great day.